All right, Michael, so we can understand, and I call this that, your explanation of John 6:4 being added provides, or it has what's called explanatory scope. If you remove John 6:4, then the gospel chronology makes a lot more sense in the way you've explained it. And as I said in the beginning, I can't say whether John 6:4 is added or not. What I can do is provide you the evidence. What's interesting to me is Eusebius, who is known, and we'll bring the quote later, of how Eusebius believes in a 3.5-year ministry. Even Eusebius admits that Matthew, Mark, and Luke record a 1-year period. Here's what Eusebius writes in his church history. Eusebius lived in the 4th century. He was the court historian of Constantine. He writes, "For it is evident that the 3 evangelists," meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke, "recorded only the deeds done by the Savior for 1 year after the imprisonment of John the Baptist, and indicated this is the beginning of their account." And what that means is that the other 2.5 years of Eusebius's reckoning of the ministry have to be before the imprisonment of John the Baptist. And we'll see that later. Let's get a quick overview of the feasts. There are 6 feasts mentioned in the Gospel of John. These are, John 2 is a Passover when Yeshua is baptized. John 5 is the unnamed feast. We're going to keep talking about the unnamed feast, the unnamed feast. That's John 5. It says, after this there was a feast of the Jews. Doesn't say the name of the feast. According to Michael's chronology, that is Shavuot. And we'll talk about that later. John 6:4 is a Passover. John 7 is Tabernacles. John 10 is Hanukkah, dedication. And John 13 is the final Passover, of course. And if you don't have John 6:4 in that mix, then you end up with the cycle exactly like the other 3 Gospels of a year. You have the exact cycles: Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, Hanukkah, and then another Passover ending that year. And John 6:4 is kind of thrown into this mix, breaking that cycle. And it isn't just Michael who said, hey, something's not right here. There have been scholars for 400 years at least who have been saying this as well. Before we get to them, I want to bring a church father. The church fathers were these early Christian authors. We'll explain more in a little bit. But this is a man named John Chrysostom, and he really hated the Jews. He particularly hated that there were Christians in his day who went to Jewish synagogues and were what he saw as Judaizing. That really burned him the wrong way. So he says, he's commenting on John 6:4, and he's dealing with the question, what on earth is Yeshua doing in the Galilee, heading north when it's Passover, and he should be heading south to Jerusalem? It makes no sense even to John Chrysostom, who hates Jews and hates the Torah. Here's what he says. How then, saith someone, does he not go up unto the feast? But when all are pressing to Jerusalem, because Passover, you go to Jerusalem on Passover, goeth himself into Galilee. That's the wrong direction. And not himself alone, but he takes his disciples with him and proceeds thence to Capernaum. If you know the geography, Capernaum is he's heading northeast. Jerusalem is southwest. So what's the reason he's going the wrong direction and he's leading a bunch of people in the wrong direction? And here's his answer of John Chrysostom, because henceforth he was quietly annulling the Torah, taking occasion from the wickedness of the Jew. And this is what you end up with John 6:4, which really doesn't make a lot of sense. He's going, there's this great movie from the 80s, one of my favorite movies. It's a movie with John Candy. I forget what it's called, but he's driving on a divided highway going on the wrong direction. And they're going down, and somebody shouts at them out the window, "You're going the wrong way." And he turns to his friend and he says, "How do they know where we're going?" But Yeshua's going the wrong way. He's heading north instead of Jerusalem for the pilgrimage. It doesn't make
the Capernaum synagogue is filled with people, too.
Right.
When he gets there.
The synagogue's filled with people. There's 5,000 people it describes. Where are they doing out in the countryside? They should all be heading to Jerusalem, not standing around without provisions, right? If they're heading to Jerusalem, then they should have food with them for the way. Instead, he's got to feed them because they were just out for an afternoon, right? They just came to hear him teach. So something doesn't fit. And this is important. Michael's not the first one to come up with this.
Oh, and not only does it not fit, this is a problem for all Christians. This isn't just a problem if you have a 1-year ministry. It's not just a problem if you believe you should obey the Torah. This is a problem for all Christians.
Right.
Even if you believe the Torah was done away at the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua, Many Christians I've talked to, and there are a few that believe that Yeshua went around purposely violating the Torah, but they're a minority. Most Christians understand that Yeshua had to be the lamb without blemish. He could not be a transgressor of the Torah and be sacrificed as a perfect sacrifice. So here we have a gospel account. If John 6:4 is in the gospel text, we have Yeshua not only disobeying the command of Passover, but taking others with him and participating in a large group of people who are not participating in Passover. A couple days later, he's in the synagogue teaching to people who are not at Passover. You have this whole problem of an entire Passovers being disregarded, and Yeshua's at the center of it.
Now, people have been struggling with this question in the Christian world for hundreds of years. And here's a quote from a man named Zachary Pierce in 1777. Zachary Pierce was not a Torah teacher. Zachary Pierce is a Protestant in, I believe, in England. And he says, some are of the opinion that the word Pascha, or Passover in John 6:4, is an interpolation. Interpolation is a fancy word meaning it was added. And I think that the whole verse is so. So he's telling us exactly what Michael said in the chronological Gospels. Michael didn't make this up. Scholars have been saying this for at least 400 years. Zachary Pierce, who, like I said, is just a regular run-of-the-mill Protestant, is telling you John 6:4 is added. Why does he think it's added? A number of reasons, but the main one here, it does not appear from the evangelist account that Jesus was present at a feast of the Passover here mentioned. And yet it seems probable that he who fulfilled all righteousness, according to Matthew 3:15, would not have been absent from a feast of the Passover, which, as is here said, was then nigh at hand. In other words, Zachary Pierce, guys, I want to tell you a secret here. Michael said something that Zachary Pierce said in 1777. Did you know Zachary Pierce said that?
It would have saved me 20 years of grieving over this if I had just learned to read English.
Well, look, so to be fair, the way we were able to find this was using very advanced databases where people have done the work for us. We just have to dig through these databases. I don't know if there's any way you could have found Zachary Pierce very easily. We were able to use it. We were able to find it and use these databases to find this information that if we were doing this 5 years ago, I would never have gotten to Zachary Pierce. It would have taken a lifetime to get that. We were able to search through these databases using very sophisticated searches. John had access to databases that it was no trivial matter to get access to these things. We're talking about the average person can't just Google this. You have to get access to these very expensive databases, and sometimes you actually, even if you pay money, it's not enough. You have to get like what's called scholars access, what we got to certain databases, and we were able to dig these up. The earliest Christian that we found who directly talks about, let's put it that way, it talks about John 6:4 having this addition, is a guy who's called Gerrit Johann Vosius, or Gerard Vos. He was a Protestant in Amsterdam who wrote a book in 1643. And we actually have the book here with us. Guys, let me show you this book. He's the first one who mentions this. This is a beautiful book. This is the original 1643 edition, and we actually got this, Michael, to give to you as a gift.
Oh, my goodness.
Before I give him the gift, I want to read Vosius and tell you how difficult it was to get this book.
Okay.
So first of all, it's written in Latin, and we had to have this section translated. And we only found out about this because we were looking in these databases that said, hey, the first one we know of that mentions this is Gerard Vosius. So in 1643, he writes, there is no need for us to say, what Michael said, that John 6:4 was first written, but the holy day of the Jews was approaching. In other words, there was a common opinion in Vosius' day that the words the Passover were added to John 6:4. That there was some feast, probably Sukkot in the next chapter, right, which they believed, or the coming chapters in John 7, that they believed that the words Passover had to be added because this broke the chronology, didn't make sense. And Vosius is saying, hey, what everybody around me is saying, that John 6:4 has two added words, the Passover, I can explain that away. He says, and the text had to do with the Holy Day Tabernacles, but the copyist, since he had not paying attention to it, wrote Pascha. This was the common opinion in 1643 in the time of Vosius. He says the ancients, and this is really important, pay attention here, guys. The ancients refers to the early Christian authors who are commonly today called the church fathers. We'll explain in a few minutes what that is. The ancients seem not to have read the word Passover at John 6. And we'll show you that it's not just seem, it's a pretty strong case. Since they say that Christ predicted 1 year or even a few months besides. So Michael, he's talking here about 1 year and change. That's what you've been teaching. They were talking about that in 1643. Henry Brown is this scholar in 1844. He's a Christian, and he's struggling to work out the chronology of the life of Yeshua. And he writes, the reading of the text in John 6:4, though it is found, I believe, in all the manuscripts. We're going to come back to those words in a minute. All the manuscripts and versions could not have been found in the text of the first 2 centuries. Meaning the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, when people are going, like we talked about before, they're going to Thessalonica and they're copying the letter to the Thessalonians. They're bringing it to their other place, and they're doing this with John as well. He's saying in the first 2 centuries, the words, the Passover in John 6:4 could not have been in the text. And what he really means is when we look at the church fathers, we do not find these words that they knew about these words. And we're going to see why he said that. Before we get to that, I want to dwell for a second on this phrase, I believe in all the manuscripts, that John 6:4 is there. That's what he says here, Henry Brown in 1844. And we in our research, spending hundreds and hundreds of hours in 4, like I said, we had 4 different people, John and I, and this man in Greece, and and T-Bone.
T-Bone.
All of us have been looking at these different sources, spending hundreds and hundreds of hours, and we kept finding this statement in all the manuscripts. John 6:4 is there. It's in all the manuscripts. It couldn't have been, the church fathers didn't know it, but it's in the writings of every manuscript that survived has John 6:4. Well, what we found is that's not true. Now, Michael already alluded to this in his chronological Gospels. He mentions 2 manuscripts. We'll get to that later in a later section. But right now, I want to talk about the church fathers. And I have to wonder if these scholars had had access to the manuscripts we have access today, what would have, how would they have understood this? Even not having the manuscripts, they were convinced these words were added in John 6:4.